Today we're talking about Akira Kurosawa's classic 1950 film Hoodwinked. We're talking about Hoodwinked. You know Hoodwinked, it's that movie you saw as a kid and look back at now only to realize that animation doesn't quite hold up like you remember it. That movie you never liked quite as much as Shrek, but was surprisingly better than Madagascar. And that movie where you were shocked by the twist as a kid, but watching it now you're like, yeah, it's obviously that guy. It's the one that you haven't consciously thought about for like 15 years, but for whatever reason, you feel like it's been occupying a locked up, tucked away crevice of your cranium that occasionally thinks back to scenes from it that feel more like repressed memories from your childhood. No, but in all honesty, Hoodwinked is a surprisingly anomalous piece of early childhood cinema. It's one of those movies that's only real impact lies with people in their late teens to early to mid 20s now. Like if people my age never spoke about it, the world would just forget it ever existed. It's not a movie as enduringly memorable as Shrek or Monsters Inc. No one's really rushing to dig up that old Hoodwinked DVD from their basement to show their kids. And yet, when I watched this thing the other day, maybe for the first time in 14, 15 years, it felt oddly, how do I say this? Alive? Maybe even timely? And not timely in the sense that it was like a precursor to the Trump era, or envisioned the future of partisan politics, or any of that bull, but timely as in it felt as creatively spirited today as it did 15 years ago. I mean, when you really think about the movie, there's a reason why you could have gone 15 years from seeing it, and moments of it still feel so visual and visceral in your head. And now maybe you're expecting me to say something like Hoodwinked is so special because in an era where animated movies were shameless, it never feels like it's pandering to kids. But that is absolutely untrue. There's a scene where a cool, crazy grandma snowboards down a hill. This thing is made for 5-year-olds with a 5-second attention span. Part of the charm of Hoodwinked is its scrappiness. And sure, there's a lot of animated movies that have a scrappy appeal. There's a whole market of cheap, D-level children's entertainment. You can find them in your local dollar store, next to the greeting cards at your 7-Eleven, but none of them are stuffed with the same vitality that Hoodwinked is. Fewer as stuffed as Hoodwinked is, period. I mean, this movie is peak 2000s animated chaos. Within the span of an 80-minute runtime, we're told a story from 4 different perspectives, we meet 30 unique and interesting fairy tale creatures, sit through multiple musical numbers, make assumptions about characters, have those assumptions shattered, hell yeah grandma, you snowboard down that hill, get immersed in a noir-style mystery, grind it out on the dance floor with Nicky Flippers, go for a ride on a roller coaster with a singing goat, get emotionally invested in the journalistic aspirations of the big bad wolf, and like a million other things. It's like a kid's idea of a fever dream, but in a wild twist of fate, it's actually funny. The writing is sharp, it has genuine perspective, it's cynical and cool in the way that Shrek is, but is less willing to use that cynicism to prevent it from wholeheartedly embracing the tropes and vibrancy that make animated movies so fun for kids. But to truly understand Hoodwinked, which is something we should all do, I guess, is to understand its origins as the first independently funded, widely released animated film. In early 2000s Hollywood, animation was an expensive game to get into, and for this reason, your big animation studios, namely Disney and DreamWorks, dominated the market, creating a high barrier to entry for independent animation filmmakers. Pixar and DreamWorks were already in the business of giving $100 million plus budgets to animated projects, and most other major animation studios weren't too far behind. Now, to give some perspective on this, Hoodwinked was released nationwide the same year that Pixar's Cars hit theaters with a $120 million budget, and DreamWorks flushed away with a $149 million budget. Think of how polished and textured the animation in both of those movies are. Hoodwinked was released into the same market as these films with a budget of only $8 million. That is nearly a 20th of what Flushed Away was made for. With live action indie filmmaking, technical shortcomings as a result of budgetary constrictions can often be overlooked by moviegoers, if not add to a film's low budget backyard appeal, because you're ultimately just watching a movie with humans, real people, just shot on a less expensive camera with less resources and less recognizable talent than another movie with humans. But when general moviegoers are expecting animated creations to look like other animated creations, and you have $8 million to produce a movie with the intention of it being viewed as widely as a Cars or Flushed Away, you need to put that $8 million to work, or no one's gonna see your movie. The reason why Hoodwinked was even able to be made in the first place was that necessary animation production software, including Maya, had only recently decreased to a price that was more reasonable for buyers who didn't have deep pockets. To make Hoodwinked work, director Corey Edwards had the movie's animation outsourced for cheap overseas, to the Philippines. He had to settle on an animation style that was cost-effective over creative, and with their limited team of animators, there was very little room for flexibility in narrative and storytelling changes later on in the animation process. Major animation studios like to settle on a rough cut of their movie, watch it, and then essentially rewrite it, adding scenes and full storylines in, taking some out, etc., based on how well it works. But that was another luxury Hoodwinked couldn't afford. These filmmakers would essentially watch their movie, see things wrong with the animation, like how in this scene it looks like the wolf is talking to his hand when he talks into the tape recorder, and from a budgetary standpoint, we're literally unable to spend time on fixing things that could be, and in most other animated movies would be polished. So, as easy as it is to look at this now, a tweet I found very candidly points out that the movie looks like a feature film adaptation of the animation on the bowling alley screens, that Hoodwinked can even be mentioned in the same breath as other animated movies from that era is kind of a miracle. But the question that loomed over the production team's head throughout the whole process was how were they going to get Hoodwinked into theaters? And after fielding an offer from DreamWorks to distribute the film, Corey Edwards and company actually turned them down, claiming it was a pretty piss-poor offer. But the long, laborious process of finding a distributor finally came to an end when, of all people, Harvey Weinstein came knocking on their door. At the time, him and his brother Bob's production company, the Weinstein Company, was pretty young, and the gross slug man, coming off of years of working under the Disney umbrella, wanted his new production company to finance an animated project of their own, to compete with the likes of his former corporate overlords. Before long, the Weinsteins had picked up the movie for distribution, and on January 13th, 2006, Hoodwinked became the first widely released, independently financed animated movie, and hit over 3,000 theaters domestically. By the end of its box office run, it had grossed close to 14 times its original $8 million budget. It had even made the shortlist for Best Animated Feature at the 2006 Academy Awards. Hoodwinked literally was the little movie that could. The director of the movie even said Hoodwinked was this freak of nature that was made completely outside of the studio system and thankfully worked. Which brings me back to my thesis, that Hoodwinked works, and not just works in that it's funny and well suited for kids, but there's a reason why I'm talking about it today. As adults, we look back at movies that we watched as kids with a sharper idea of what the movie's intentions and lessons are. Not to say that kids' brains are too small to learn lessons from movies, I'm not saying that at all, but when we grow up, we can better understand where the people who made that movie were coming from. It's one of the beautiful experiences about cinema. We watch a movie as 8-year-olds and we enjoy it for its colorful animation and how much it appeals to our sense of humor at the time, and watch the same movie as 28-year-olds and appreciate it for what it's saying about capitalism or communism or any of the isms, or what it says about life, lessons that we could glean from it. I love movies like this, and yet I wouldn't group Hoodwinked in with these movies. The elements of Hoodwinked that I've carried with me through my life, and I know that's a ridiculous statement, are less in its wisdom and more in the movie's moxie, and its ambition. And in the same way that I can't articulate why a movie's theme resonates with me when I'm watching it as a kid, but can years later when I'm watching it as an adult with actual life experience, Hoodwinked had an ambition that I couldn't quite put to words as a kid, but I think I can now. That first scene of Red walking in on the big bad wolf dressed as Granny, Granny jumping out of the closet, the woodsman bursting through the window, before we cut to Nicky Flipper strutting in on the nighttime shift to interrogate the clan and get to the bottom of this mystery, offered up a level of intrigue hitherto unseen by a young cinephile such as myself. I don't think I'm alone in saying it was probably more formative to my development as someone interested in storytelling and filmmaking than most of the things I watched when I was younger. I have to say, it grounded some loftier cinematic concepts within an environment that an 8-year-old's brain could understand. It was my introduction to nonlinear storytelling and noir and mystery, and the cleverness of interconnected storylines. It was my introduction to cinema that literally felt like a roller coaster ride, immersing viewers in its mile-a-minute characters, world, and antics. But it uses this whodunit, same story from 4 different perspectives framing device as a clever prism to capture the movie's freneticism within. And it's doing something rare in children's media in that it's asking kids to be skeptical of each of these cute, easily lovable characters they meet along the way, because one of them is the Goody Bandit. Hoodwinked is not an excellent movie by any standard. It's messy and stupid, and there are movies I watched as a kid that had a bigger impact on me at the time, and have a bigger impact on me when I'm watching them now. But few wear their imperfections on their sleeves like Hoodwinked, a film whose imperfections actually contribute to its overall charm and appeal. And honestly, none of them fill me with as much immediate excitement upon thinking about them as something like Hoodwinked does. And maybe it's because it never had to trudge through the process of studio executives doling out notes and revisions to make it as polished and coherent and four-quadranty as possible, that you get this movie that is both frenzied and shameless and prone to pandering and non sequitur, but is so animated at every moment. It takes a lot of elements and characters that kids are pretty familiar with and places them outside the walls of the stories we know them from. Which kind of sounds like a simple, even lazy way to earn points for subverting expectations, especially in a post-Shrek era, but when you're familiar with the visual of Red Riding Hood in the woods, on her way to her grandma's house, as a wolf tries to lure her toward him, then, for example, placing a disheartened Red among a sea of decaying flowers after the revelation that Granny's been hiding her extreme athlete career from her is certainly going to expand that child's idea of how stories, no matter how classic or revered, can be stretched and resized and reappropriated beyond the way they've been fed it on the page. I'd argue that's part of the reason why this movie is so fun to experience as a kid, and why so much of it sticks with so many. Because it strangely feels limitless. The world itself feeling so odd and awkward makes it endlessly interesting to a kid who's at least subconsciously used to this or this. Animation that is refined and without blemish is all well and good, but it's a fairly limiting way to view an entire genre. Animation that is unrefined and plastic can be deeply unsettling. It can make you feel like you're descending into the depths of hell, that someone spent enough time on something to make it look animated, but not enough time on it to make it feel like it's well animated, and somehow slipping that out to 3,000 theaters across the nation is Hoodwinked. And going back to the comedy in this movie is so funny. And the animation, as simplistic and gravity-defying as it may be, goes a long way toward amplifying it. The humor has the zippiness of a Saturday morning cartoon, but enough refinement and maturity so that it actually feels somewhat intelligent. Then, there are jokes in this movie that land because of how deceptively simple and unintelligent they are. Like, there's a character in this movie named Raccoon Jerry. Like, that's literally the character's name. That's hilarious. Or there's this guy, who is clearly just a human male furry pretending to be a woodland animal. And don't even get me started on Be Prepared by my man Japeth the Goat. Should have won the Oscar for Best Song. Should have been the last Oscar they ever gave out. It just doesn't get better than this guy right here. If I could do a comparison for a moment to, let's say, Pixar's Soul, which is objectively imaginative and brilliant, but as much as I love it, I don't think Soul would have hit me in the same way that it did if I watched it as a kid. Its message and creativity is almost more appealing to me as a 23-year-old than it is to a 10-year-old. Soul's an example of what happens when the message becomes the movie, which is in no way a bad thing. Soul has a beautiful, life-affirming message. I finished it and I felt like I could run 7 marathons and conquer my anxiety. But now look at Hoodwinked, which is focused on making you feel weird and good at every moment. It rides a line of pandering and unmistakable creativity in a genre where, increasingly, animated movies are becoming one or the other. Hoodwinked is dated now, there's no denying that. I called it timely at the beginning of the video because it still pops off the page, but it's not necessarily timeless. I mean, in fact, it looks like a movie lost in time. But if it's already made its greatest impact on kids born from a weird group of parents who let this one slip through the cracks, then so be it. As admirers of film, and in some cases creatives ourselves, I think we oftentimes try to embellish what our cinematic influences were when we were growing up. We like to gain points for being prodigious by saying that by watching Mulholland Drive at age 11 or Seven Samurai at age 13, we first experienced what true cinema was, and that's what set us on a path of curiosity and exploration of the art form. And experiences like this happen where a movie that we have no real entry point into has a sort of unexplainable impact on us, but when citing our influences, I think we oftentimes favor or embellish experiences like that and discount the impact of movies like Hoodwinked, which isn't exactly high art, its flaws are fairly pronounced, but affect us in a greater way than we'd probably like to admit. Sometimes the movies that we consider formative aren't the ones that most artfully convey their message, they're the ones that most adamantly convey ideas. Big, bold, silly ideas that widen our definition of what cinema can and shouldn't be. And in Hoodwinked's case, there are worse things a movie can do than put the kids in the driver's seat as it goes for a ride that is wild, crude, creatively stimulating, and I doubly stress, ambitious as hell. And now, in the immortal words of Andy Dick's Boingo, you've been hoodwinked, baby. So I know some of you may bring up that there was a Hoodwinked sequel, but I actually don't think there ever was. Yeah, that movie actually never happened. It never existed. I think you were all just like Mandela affected. Very strange. Anyway, if you like this video, please like and subscribe for more movie and TV related content. I'm Justin Cook. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.